it would be strange for somebody to say, I don't get what a perception is, right? Because it's sort of obvious what it is. And if intuition doesn't have that same feature, then that's got to be traceable to some component or something about intuitions, if they exist, that we can make sense of. So the goal here is to try to sort of demystify them by taking away their phenomenology, right?
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Marc Moffett. He is Associate Professor at the University of Texas at El Paso, and his work is focused on epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, and metaphysics. He has various published works on these and related topics, including his recent book published with Cambridge Elements titled The Indispensability of Intuitions, and that element is going to be our focus for today. But yeah, feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Moffett.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Sweet. So I did want to kind of just jump right in here on this element titled the Indispensability of Intuitions, which is maybe a little bit of a provocative title, but something that you're going to spend it's not super long, but still you're going to spend a fair amount of time arguing for it. I did sort of think at the outset, like, okay, just theorizing about intuitions can be sort of difficult, since it's maybe not super obvious at the outset what intuition is even supposed to be. Some people think it's a kind of belief, or maybe some sort of inclination to belief, or something like that. Now, this is not the view you take, but maybe you could start by commenting on that, like the different approaches, and then like the sort of, at least generally speaking, view about intuitions that you come to.
Sure. So I think that, I come out of a tradition philosophically that takes intuition pretty seriously as an important kind of epistemic or evidential kind of basic evidence. So one way to think about why somebody might view intuitions as its own kind of sui generis mental state is because many of the other takes on intuitions, like that they're just beliefs, don't really serve the epistemic function that many of us think it needs to serve in order to sort of account for our overall knowledge of the world. Now, that view, right, has been defended for a long time. Larry Bonjour, George Buehler, and others early on in contemporary philosophy have defended this idea that somehow intuitions are essential to certain kinds of knowledge in particular, right? Whether that's, sort of a priori basic knowledge of axioms or in thought experiments. The sort of take I have is that it's actually a much more pervasive phenomenon in all of our knowledge claims. So that's sort of the further step, right? It's not just indispensable, but actually pervasive or ubiquitous in our knowledge.
Good, yeah, and we'll definitely get into that as we go along. But one concern that I've seen some people have is that, well, okay, when you say that intuitions is sort of intellectual seeming of a certain sort, is some sort of sui generis state, not like the other ones that maybe have already been categorized. That might be sort of mysterious, like what that's supposed to be. I mean, some people might say, like, what? Maybe I don't even have states like that. This is sort of absent intuition worry. And this is sort of something that comes up a bit later, but I thought maybe we could cover it now. Like, what do you make of this concern that, A, it might not even be clear what an intuition is supposed to be, but B, well, maybe we just don't, some people at least don't feel like they even have that sort of thing. I guess, what do you think about that?
No, I think it's an important, actually a very important criticism. So I'm going to try to answer you a little bit in a roundabout way. So there's two things I think that have occurred recently in sort of internalist epistemology, foundationalist epistemology, right? One is this kind of move towards moderate dogmatism, whether you think of that in terms of Jim Pryor's work or Mike Humer's phenomenal conservatism. And the other is this sort of push by people like Chudnoff and Bengson toward kind of analogizing or giving a common analysis of intuition and perception in particular. So both those two strains in current foundationalist epistemology naturally push us in the direction of treating intuition as sort of essentially this robust phenomenological state, right? You see that a lot in Chudnoff's work, right? So there's supposed to be this very robust, specific kind of phenomenology associated with intuition that maps the kind of robust phenomenology associated with perception, or visual perception in particular. And once you make that move, once you think, okay, we've got these two trains, right? These two strains of thought in contemporary foundationalism that push us in the direction of treating intuition phenomenologically. Then when you run into these kinds of absent intuition arguments, Sosa and Williamson, I mean, they're not so much arguments as just, their reflections on kind of what's going on in their own introspective world, right? You have problems because the phenomenology shouldn't be that weak or that absent if they're really functioning the way this sort of phenomenological approach to intuitions suggests. And that can then make them seem mysterious and controversial, right? I mean, you can think about it this way, and maybe this is a bit too blunt, but it would be strange for somebody to say, I don't get what a perception is, right? Because it's sort of obvious what it is. And if intuition doesn't have that same feature, then that's got to be traceable to some component or something about intuitions, if they exist, that we can make sense of. So the goal here is to try to sort of demystify them by by taking away their phenomenology, right? And once we do that, then we can focus more on sort of their epistemic role. So treat them more functionally as sort of how we triangulate on them.
Right. Yeah, and we're definitely we'll definitely explore that further as well. But you mentioned John Bengson there, and that's someone you've worked with on several projects already. But as you discussed, your view sort of diverges from him in certain ways that I think we'll explore further. But yeah, is that something you've talked with him a lot about on these issues and how you come apart? Or
yeah. So John and I are good friends, and he's a super smart guy. I appreciate his work on this, and I actually think our views don't come apart as much as might seem. I mean, I think my views and Chudnoff's and others come apart more. So if you look at John's work on the intellectual given, for instance, in that paper, a lot of it really is much more functional, and the phenomenology is much more in the background in that paper, even though he's, I think, rightly analogizing to perception, because I do think these are similar kinds of cognitive states. But nevertheless, when I've spoken with him, he doesn't go along with me. He thinks that presentationality of intuition and perception is a phenomenological notion. So we do come apart there, but I don't think it's actually something that his view in particular is tied to. I mean, he could go along with my view without really losing much of anything.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And also, for some people that think that, well, some sort of belief-based approach to, or something like beliefs approach to intuitions is right. I wonder, maybe sometimes the dispute is a little terminological. So maybe some people are understanding belief and judgment and commitment and related notions in a way maybe that's more broad, that might include these sorts of states that you would call intuitions. Well, it's sort of like a quasi-judgment, or maybe. So yeah, and then for people like that, maybe it wouldn't be so surprising then that they don't find something extra that would count as an intuition is sort of already there on a different label. So I don't know. What do you think about that? And maybe more broadly, like, well, to what degree do you think some of these disputes are like semantic or terminological?
Yeah, in general, I don't think there's just semantic or terminological, right? I think people are there's this sort of identified need epistemologically for states that serve a certain kind of function. Now, whether they can be, assimilated to beliefs or judgments or anything else, maybe a philosophical question of substance. But there's clearly something going on in many instances of thought experiments, of sort of axiomatic judgments and inference. If you look at some of the things about the taking condition in Boghossian, for instance, you've got to say something about these things, and the question is can anything like a belief, which has a certain kind of epistemic profile, like an acceptance, right? It's an acceptance of a certain proposition or situation, right? Can that kind of thing play the right epistemic role, right? And what I think, and I think those of us broadly in the intuition camp, right, think that it can't. That you really need a specific state that's much more like a perception or introspection that has a kind of foundational epistemic profile in order to account for those things. It can't be dispensed with. So I don't think it's just semantic. I think there's something substantive there. You could get rid of them if you could show that these other states actually do that epistemic work. I just don't think that anybody's shown that.
Right, and then along those lines, you could say, well, okay, maybe if it's assimilated into this other category, it's still real. We're still getting at something, whether you want to call them something else or this. There's something playing that role, or there should be, if that makes sense. Would you say something like that?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, I would take myself to have given up the battle if I thought intuition could be assimilated to, for instance, a certain kind of belief. So I do think that in that sense, there's a substantive debate going on that's not merely semantic. And that's because I think beliefs can't play certain roles, right? I mean, if you think about the standard regressive reasons kind of arguments, they're not going to be able to handle those in the same way that some kind of foundational source of evidence like perception or intuition would play. So if it turned out that beliefs could do that, or all we needed was perception, then I would take myself to have lost the battle on that.
Yeah, fair enough. And one more sort of general worry before getting into some of the more the content here. When I think about sort of modeling or categorizing our mental lives, and I mean, our cognition and mental lives are very messy and complicated, and sometimes I worry that dividing it up into these neat categories like belief and desire and so on might oversimplify or lose some of the accuracy, or just be maybe not even a great model, especially when we want to do some more robust theorizing about it. Maybe I'm not putting the words so precisely, but I mean, what do you make of this and of this kind of just general methodological worry?
So I do think that it's certainly figuring out what's going on sort of in the ontology of mind is definitely a more challenging than just sort of introspecting and saying, oh, I have this state, right? I mean, I think one thing that the absent intuition challenge suggests here, right, if you're looking at it from my point of view, is exactly that some of what's going on in the mind is not quite so obvious or transparent that we can just sort of cut everything up. So part of the I think methodological strategy is to say, look, what kinds of things do we need in order to account for, some of what, much of what we want to say about knowledge and justification and so forth. And so, you're sort of trying to figure out how the mind has to be in order to make sense of how we talk about knowledge and justification. And so it's a little bit of back engineering in that sense, right? And in a way, that's kind of the core move in the book, right? Is to say that we need these things, and many of the other kinds of things we have, like inclinations to believe or belief, simply just they don't do the right work, and so we need to have something else. So, I don't know how that maps onto a view of the mind as messy or not fully categorized, but that may be a broader or deeper background, just difference in sort of mental ontology.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah. And so we should explore this epistemological stuff further. I mean, you already mentioned foundationalism and moderate dogmatism, I believe. Do you mind? And we're going to get into your argument against phenomenalism. Or arguments, I suppose. Do you mind sort of introducing some of these notions here, like moderate dogmatism and phenomenalism and some of those things?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess it was, early in the 2000s, right? Mike Humer and Jim Pryor both were advocating for views according to which certain kinds of mental states, in particular perceptual states, sort of gave us a kind of defeasible foundational justification for corresponding belief states. So if it perceptually seems to me that there's a tree in front of me, then I have some defeasible justification for believing that there's a tree. So that broadly speaking, that family of views that count as a kind of internalist, foundationalist epistemology is what I'm characterizing as moderate dogmatism. I think the term comes from Jim Pryor. And so I think that's if you're going to be a foundationalist, I think this is really the most plausible direction. That view gets caught up, especially with Humer's work, right? With this kind of notion of a broader notion of phenomenological states, right? That comes out of Tolhurst on seemings and somewhat on Buehler on seemings. That it's not just like perceptual seemings, but there's other states, intellectual seemings or memorial seemings, or some broad class of unified states that have a similar profile in that something about them, right, generates a prima facie justification for belief. Okay, so that is sort of the general view of moderate dogmatism. We'll call those states seemings, right? So perceptual seemings, intellectual seemings, introspective seemings. More recent work, Bengson, Chudnoff, Koksvik, and others have sort of argued that what makes these seemings have this feature is their phenomenology. So there's something about the phenomenology and the way the phenomenology of these states works that generates that, right? And so they use, John is pretty above board about this, right? He calls it quasi-perceptualism, right? They use perception as the model. And when you use perception as the model for seemings, you're naturally going to make use of, the robust phenomenology of perception. And I think that's what you see in these places. So the idea is that phenomenalism says that what's accounting for the evidential potency of seemings, or right, these foundational states, is their phenomenology, right? And it's that claim that it's the phenomenology that's doing the work is the one that I sort of go against in the book.
Right. Yeah. So I do want to cover a few things here. First, on the sort of moderate dogmatist, foundationalist, internalist picture, yada yada yada. Well, I'm personally sort of not a big fan of it, and I don't want to ramble too much about my own view. But okay, when people think about the Munchausen trilemma or the Agrippa's trilemma, it's like, either some sort of foundationalism or coherentism or infinitism has to be the case. Sort of those have to be the general structures of the of justification, if there is any, And I sort of reject that because, well, I'm sort of the view that our normal epistemic concepts are so although there's some general features that they have, they're kind of variable and messy, and I just don't think they admit of that they're getting at something that admits of those sorts of structural features, if that makes sense. And that's at least for our ordinary epistemic context. Maybe there's some sort of ideal philosophical notion, maybe, but I'm not exactly sure what that is, and it seems like a change of subject to me. But anyway, I don't want to ramble too much about my own views here, but I suppose, what do you think about this reaction to foundationalism or some of the more traditional approaches in epistemology on the basis that, well, that doesn't seem to really capture our normal epistemic concepts, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So, part of that, like, especially in the book, right, I start kind of with the background assumption that I'm speaking to a certain kind of epistemological orientation, which is
right.
kind of internalist foundationalism. But, it's fair, like to say these are complex, difficult items. Now, I think they do map on pretty well to our normal use of a lot of these terms. So if it's okay, I'll just go on a little bit of a tangent. So I do in other places
Sure.
currently working on. My view is that a lot of this work is actually a lot of what's going on in epistemology is more based on actually our doxastic actions rather than sort of justifying belief states themselves generally or directly. So I tend to think of justification in the same way that we would of like a judgment as an action rather than justification of a belief as a state. And I think when you put it in that context, it actually jives pretty well with this idea that, look, this broad notion of justification of actions themselves is much more amorphous, and so you'd have to think of justification of belief states coming out of that. It's either grounded in it or something like that. So it is a bit more of a theoretical notion, I think, than our ordinary use. But I don't think it's a distortion of that use.
So maybe more of like a precisification, maybe, or something like that.
Yeah, or just a way of saying, look, we throw the term justification around. It shows up in all sorts of contexts in ordinary language. One sort of standard place it shows up might pick out one kind of concept, the justification of beliefs. But if you're just sort of running together a lot of the ordinary language uses or common daily uses of justification, it might not. That happens with intuition itself, right? I mean, people who defend intuition have been, spend a lot of time trying to explain. I don't mean hunches or gut feelings or guesses or vibes or any of this stuff. And so it's a bit of trying to find what the philosophically useful concept that is there in ordinary usage, but often gets this kind of polysemous use across multiple contexts.
Right. And so also related, although maybe this is sort of the same word that I just expressed, but when you talk about internalism and one of the reasons you favor internalist approach, and I think you cite Bengson on this, has to do with, well, externalist accounts sort of fail to connect with a thinker's responsibility for cognitive practice and so on, and can't explain the rationality of cognitive action. But that sort of approach seems to be relevant if the target of our everyday epistemic notions is something that satisfies that role. And I think that's one of the roles maybe that it's supposed to satisfy us at least sometimes. But I'm sort of less convinced that like it does like exclusively, or entirely has to satisfy that role. I mean, I'm sort of the mind that, like, okay, sometimes when we employ these epistemic notions, what we're really getting at is at least partly external features, so maybe how good their faculties are in general, even if it's not something, the reliability of them is not something internally accessible or whatever. is that the only role they play? No, probably not. But I think sometimes we're getting at that, it seems to me. But anyway, maybe I'm just sort of echoing the same worry that I would express. But
well, I think this is fine. I mean, I actually think that this may be one of those places where it's not quite just a semantic dispute, but I think there is a point where I'm willing to say, justification itself may be an externalist notion, reliabilism may play a role, whatever it is you want. There may be a coherent notion and a useful philosophical notion there. But that doesn't keep us from needing this other internalist notion to explain certain other features of our cognitive lives, and in particular the normative features of them, right? So whether you sort of think the new evil demon problem is a serious problem, or whether you should just kind of partition epistemic normativity in a certain way, there's this thing that is normatively epistemically correct in the evil demon world, that's but it's not really justification. That's fine. I mean, that may be, I'm willing to give up the concept of justification there. But I do think if you make that move, that the notion of justification actually is a lot less significant. So, I mean, as I see it, it's the sort of internalist notion of justification or blameless belief or something like that is really doing the heavy lifting.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah, I guess, especially when I think about related issues in the rationality of action and decision theory, okay, even if in some sense there's a justification of action or belief that might be at least partly external, in those contexts when we're assessing rationality, really, if not entirely, primarily concerned with these internal things like did they act or believe or update on the basis of reasons or what they had access to or something like that. That makes sense. Okay, and then some of the critiques you have for phenomenalism here. I do definitely want to explore the kind of the zombie argument thing, but one hypothetical you consider is this sort of blindsight or what was it, a super blindsight scenario, where people can sort of come to the correct judgments about certain things without seeing them, without actually having I should clarify, without having the visual experience or the phenomenal experience of seeing them. But in a way, we want to say that maybe in some of those cases, or at least in cases where they have the super blindsight, they'd be justified in their beliefs, but you can't account for that if it's the phenomenal character that does the work there. Anyway, can you explain that a bit more and how you think this is a good problem for phenomenalist views?
Yeah. So I actually think that the phenomenology, and I kind of state this in the book, is neither necessary nor sufficient. So I give cases in which it fails both directions. But I think these are tricky examples. So when you have cases like super blindsight, it really matters how you're describing the situations. So I discuss Smithy's recent work on this stuff, where he's trying to argue that the phenomenology really is essential to the epistemic standing of our states. And if you look at some of these, just intuitive cases, I don't think these are tight arguments. I think they're suggestive to help us sort of see how these things might come apart. When you look at things like super blindsight, where you assume that people have some kind of state, which might be a seeming state, that's different than assuming that they just, as it were, have a state where they seem to be guessing or have learned to guess. So if you look at blindsiders, or it's actual blindsight or super blindsight, it's actually super duper blindsight, right? That is the kind of state that you really want to be looking at to adjudicate the difference between a phenomenological approach to seemings and a non-phenomenological approach, right? Everything else just falls short of that. So super blindsight or super duper blindsight, I take it, suggests that the phenomenology is not necessary. And then there's these cases that have recently been discussed on derealization disorder, where you have this very robust phenomenology. You can suppose it could be super duper derealization disorder, right? And so it could be every bit like ours, but we still don't take the phenomenology to be of the actual world. And so you could have the robust phenomenology without really the corresponding pull towards believing it. And as a result, I think that it's not sufficient either. So you've got to have, it's really about how we uptake the information and not about how we experience that, the world, right? And that's why, I think the zombies come into play here, although in a complex way.
Right. Yeah. And then, as you say, you have the sort of zombie argument, and it's a bit complicated, but I don't know. Do you mind giving a sort of overview of the argument you make there? Maybe we don't have to go into all the details, but
yeah. So Beeler gives this self-consciousness argument, which I think is pretty devastating towards reductive functionalist approaches. And basically, the argument says, look, reductive functionalism can't get the right content for our mental states without sort of failing to be reductive, without leaving mental states on the right-hand sides of our functional definitions. So I think George is right about that. But he goes on then to suggest that maybe mental states have non-reductive functional definitions, right? So rather than treating the functional definitions as quantifying over realizer states, you allow the variables in the functional definitions to range over the mental states themselves. Okay, so if you do that, then the mental states will trivially satisfy the definitions. Okay, right, because all you're doing is taking them out and putting them back in. So that's right. Now, if only the mental states satisfy those definitions, right, because of this sort of non-well-foundedness, the fact that the mind can be about the mind, then those definitions will actually define the mentals. So that's his argument for non-reductive functional definitions of the mentals. So it's a dualist, friendly version of functionalism. So I don't think he's right about that. I think that the problem is he tries to rule out certain cases in his paper by suggesting that, there might, you could come up with Cambridge-like examples, like you just take one item out of the extension of the relation or whatever, and these are just hokey, philosopher moves. And so he rules those out. But I don't think he adequately addresses cases where you have like systematic phenomenological shifts. So, the phenomenology of a state that is playing the pain role is just slightly different from pain phenomenology, right? I don't see any reason to think that's not possible, that there couldn't be, as it were, alien phenomenology. Of course, we wouldn't know what that's like, but I have no reason to doubt that's possible. And so I don't think he really is going to get the actual standard mental states like pain, belief, and so forth that way. So instead, what I say in the element is, look, but you can use those definitions to define a determinable state, right? This sort of very broad group of states that are all functionally the same, right? But each determinant is, a specific way of satisfying that functional role. So pain would be one way, and alien pain would be another, and so forth. Okay, so you can accommodate that. And given that, I argue that there's not any reason not to allow in a state that satisfies those roles, but lacks any phenomenology, or certainly any robust phenomenology of the sort typically utilized in these cases. So, that intuition seems okay. It seems right because it's the thing that's driving already Chalmers' argument anyway, right? The zombie argument originally. It's not really a different point. It seems possible that there could be a state that satisfies that. But then if it really is satisfying all of the fundamental psychological rules, right, it's satisfying core psychology, then the argument is it would be ad hoc or unmotivated to resist the claim that those states could be epistemically justified. Okay, and if that's right, then it can't be the phenomenology that's doing the epistemic work.
Great. Good. Yeah. So just broadly speaking, it's the point is that, look, it seems that there could be these zombies that lack phenomenology, but are otherwise in the same epistemic situation as us. But if we're justified in, for various beliefs, then they should be justified too. But it's not because of the phenomenology at all that they're justified. So that's the basic point. So phenomenalism would be false. And you have to go through this. The initial stuff you went through there was for thinking that you could have something like a zombie in this way. Is that broadly correct?
Yeah. So I mean, you might think that the sort of roundabout, direction through the determinate relation and all that, it's actually, I think, important because there's you might say, look, it's not pain if it doesn't have the right phenomenology, right? So there's ways in which I think that we can become parochial in our philosophical theorizing by focusing too much on exactly how our cognition works, right? And not thinking more generally about how cognition works, right? In many different kinds of things. I mean, this is important for recent work in AI, right? So here we have actually very similar cognition, even though it's, fundamentally different in terms of phenomenology, but functionally it's all the same. And again, it just seems to me that if you're going to theorize at the level of philosophy, right, as opposed to sort of philosophical psychology, that you should be able to capture what is normatively similar between us and those kinds of creatures that otherwise satisfy the same kind of psychological theory that we do. Right? That doesn't seem like a big stretch to me.
Yeah, fair enough. I was thinking one reply, that's sort of along the lines of Smithy's, is that, well, what if maybe the right approach here is that if zombies actually lack phenomenology altogether, well, then they either wouldn't have beliefs or wouldn't have the same beliefs that we do, and so either way, it wouldn't be in the same epistemic situation as us. Maybe phenomenology is part of what individual each believes or something like that, or maybe it's even required to have beliefs in the first place. I don't know. What do you think about this sort of reply about phenomenology and beliefs?
Yeah. So I mean, that actually is the reason for the generalization. It's to actually address that, right? So the thought is that I don't want to argue about whether zombies have beliefs or not, or have pain or not, right? What I want to argue is that they're logically possible creatures that satisfy the same general psychological theory as us, right? They update belief-like states the same way we do. They do all the same things. They have acceptance. They have all the same distinctions, right? They just lack the phenomenology. And as a result, right, I think it's a kind of a bit of a burden shifting argument, right? If they're really like us in all those functional respects, even if they lack beliefs, their states should be governed by the same kind of epistemic norms that our states are governed by. Right. Now, I mean, you could say, well, yes, they're governed by those. I make this point in the book is, because it's reliabilism. Right. So reliabilism can handle this no problem. Right. It's just if you want to be an internalist. So I think the place that my view comes under the greatest pressure here is that I really do require a picture of something like access consciousness or a non-phenomenological notion of consciousness, which I'm happy to do. I think it's an underexplored area. It's kind of overrun by thinking about block and access consciousness and global workspace theory. I think there's more to it there, but that really is like, I think the wedge that the view I'm advocating will stand or fall on, whether that notion makes sense.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And I suppose also, I mean, maybe what I'm getting at is that someone could sort of dig their heels in and say, look, there are these functional similarities between our cognition and the cognition of the zombies, but that's not enough to for the relevant epistemic norms to apply. You need to have the phenomenology. So I suppose, what if someone just digs their heels and say, no, the functional features aren't enough. Phenomenology makes a difference. What would you say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, part of my answer would be, if you're going to dig your heels in, right? I mean, okay, but more seriously, I would want to know what difference the phenomenology is making, right? So if you tell me that the phenomenology is doing the work of giving us it's doing the epistemic work, right, in the way that like Chudnoff's view suggests, right, that it's the phenomenology of having a truth maker and a proposition, and if that's what's doing the work, then you've told me why the phenomenology matters. I think I've argued that's not really what's doing the work. So putting that aside, right, it's not enough to just say the phenomenology is necessary unless you tell me what the work is that it's doing in order to motivate the difference. And here, it's sort of relevant to the positive view that I take. So I kind of, was influenced by Uriah Kriegel's stuff on consciousness, right, where he talks about, sorry if I forget the phrasing here, but that to believe that Russell exists is to represent as existing Russell, right? So it's the sort of the existence component is kind of built into the nature of the attitude rather than into the content of the intentional state, right? And there's something about that I find super appealing as far as just a purely intentionalist view of what's going on in seemings. So seemings are ways of grasping things as actual. I mean, this view actually shows up. Koksvik, hope I say his name right, has this. He calls it objectivity, right? It's the objectivity of the content. But really, once you have that notion, right, which is what I'm calling the presentationality, right, is once you have that notion, I don't know that you need anything more. And there's no reason why zombies, right, of the sort I defend, right, couldn't have that kind of uptake of content. It's a difference between, taking something as representing and just taking something as being there, right, in the world, more or less directly. So, it does depend a little bit. So I have a positive view on why zombies should be able to have these states. And as far as I know, right, the phenomenologist, right, doesn't have a corresponding argument. So it's not needed.
Yeah, all right. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So then from that, okay, we get that intuitions or these sort of seemings are not, at least not necessarily phenomenal in this way, or it's not the phenomenal character that plays this role. So then you sort of move towards a non-phenomenal presentational dogmatism. Can you sort of introduce this view, and maybe starting with what a presentationality? I mean, you already mentioned that briefly, but yeah.
Sure. So if you look at a lot of the characterizations of like seemings, like if you look at Tolhurst's original characterization in his paper on seemings, right, he says something like seemings seem to be revelatory of an external world, right? So this vocabulary of or way of thinking about perception itself, but a lot of our states that we want to think of as seeming seem to be revelatory in this way. They seem to make it appear as if something just is there, right? So when I see a tree, I don't seem to see a representation or anything like that, right? It just I seem to be presented with a tree. And my way of articulating that idea, right, is not phenomenological, that there's this phenomenology of there being a tree there, but rather that I grasp the content of, right, that there's a tree there or a tree's being there, right? I grasp that content as being actual, as being in the world. So it's the idea is that, there's different ways of having intentional contents, right? One is belief, accepting, proper representation is true. One is like assumption, like holding it as true for some period of time, right? One is considering it, right? And then so one is it being presented or being taken as actual. So the idea then is you just have this brute relation of how you uptake the information that's different from belief, and it's that's doing the epistemic work.
Right. Yeah, and it's non-phenomenal in character, or at least not necessarily phenomenal in character, and interesting. I wonder what do you think are the I don't know, the upshots or benefits of thinking about intuitions in this way. I suppose we still have to get to some of the other aspects, especially the conceptual argument that you make. But what do you think the sort of benefits or upshots of this approach is?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's fairly substantive, right? Because if this is right, and if you're sort of treating all seemings on a par, then in effect the sort of the phenomenology of perception itself is not going to have any epistemic import, right? It'll just be the same, right? Zombie perception is going to have the same epistemic import as our perception. So, I think it's kind of moderately, revisionary in that sense. But I think more importantly, and this maybe anticipates something you wanted to talk about, is that by treating intuitions as not being heavily reliant on phenomenology, right? It's easier to make the case that they're much more pervasive in cognition because we're very phenomenologically driven. Our attention is driven by phenomenology. So it's more difficult for us to focus on our access to states that have, weak or non-existent, whatever it is, phenomenology. And so, it's in a way, that's my way of, for instance, dealing with the absent intuition arguments, right? That they're there. Sosa and Williamson are aware of them. They're just, because they're not phenomenologically salient, they get sort of swamped by the salience of the inclinations to believe that they give rise to, and so forth. So it's that feature that I'm trying to make use of in order to make the case that they show up much more generally in cognition.
Right. Yeah, I was just thinking, what is another potential response to this sort of zombie argument? What if someone were to grant that, okay, you can have justification even without the phenomenology, so maybe the pure phenomenologist picture is not correct, but nevertheless, the phenomenology can offer more or a different sort of justification. So would you accept that, or what do you think about that sort of approach?
Yeah, I've actually been thinking a bit about this recently. So my position when I wrote The Element was that I don't really need to argue that that's not true. So that the zombies that I'm imagining don't actually need to be perfect functional duplicates even of us, not even functional duplicates of us, right? It's just that they have enough similarity, right? That they are like us, right? Epistemically, that it's hard to resist that transition. So on the one hand, I tend to think that there may be work that phenomenology is doing if that's so, it's still not enough to give us to undercut the argument that the phenomenology is not doing all or most of the epistemic work. Excuse me, I got a cough. But more recently, I've started to think that their zombies can be, complete functional duplicates of us. It's just that, right? This is going to turn a little bit on maybe some contentious points about like underdetermination. So I've been kind of playing with some Quinean ideas about, how one would reinterpret, kind of zombie language into our language, because it's like you're narrowing the number, right? If you think they lack phenomenology, we have it. We have access to our phenomenology. Then we have states that are accessing our phenomenological states. They don't have those phenomenological states. So what are they doing, right? And I think that underdetermination considerations may make it plausible that there's something else that they're doing, right? And it may end up that they, for instance, end up with more Frege puzzles than us or something like that. But they'll have, I don't see any in principle reason why they can't be essentially functional duplicates of us. I just want to be clear to answer your question that I don't actually think anything turns on that. I'm happy to concede that there may be differences and there may be things that we know that they don't and can't know. But there will be things like that, right? In the same way that you can't know what it's like to be a bat, right? Or what in exactly that way. So there's access that we have that they don't, but that doesn't mean that they're not covered by the normative epistemic constraints.
Right. So maybe there's still some differences, but still the pure phenomenologist approach is definitely wrong. And so your argument would still go through, but that could definitely be explored further. Okay, so then moving on to another key part of this element is an argument for thinking that intuitions are indispensable to our usual conceptual practices. So like concept application in the relevant sense, on your view, requires intuitions. So do you mind, or at least often requires intuition. Do you mind introducing this and explaining how you think intuitions are indispensable here?
Sure. If you think about like what are the plausible informational inputs from things like perception or perceptual states, and you think about the kinds of judgments we typically make. So this shows up, of course, in thought experiments like the Gettier thought experiments, I think, but doesn't hinge on that, right? So I think the Gettier thought experiments are simply intuitions about concept application or concept application intuitions. So I'm just following Beeler on this. Our visual input is more impoverished than many of the basic judgments we tend to make about things. So one example, I've sort of recently writing a piece for Ion on this. So one example I've used recently is like when writers are writing a story, right? One kind of cliche bit of information they give is to show, don't tell, right? And so if you think, J.R. Tolkien's writing the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and he has this scene where Gollum leads Frodo and Sam into the lair of this giant spider. I forget its name. There's a point where we, as it were, just recognize, right, that this is, Gollum betraying them, right? We're not told that. It just seems to us that this is a betrayal. Okay, I don't think that's an inference. It's not a subtle inference. I think that a lot of times philosophers want to rely on this kind of, it's some kind of subpersonal or down and dirty, quick inference, right? But the fact of the matter is that we just get it, that it's a betrayal. And so I think that in a lot of cases where we're characterizing the behaviors, or whether something counts as a justification or a betrayal, or any number of other things, right? This is just us having a concept application intuition that, in this circumstance, that concept, in fact, must hold. So there's a little bit of subtlety in some of the discussion there about like the deontic must versus the metaphysical possibility must, or logical possibility must, right? So many people who've written on this, take it like, oh, in the Gettier cases, he must not know. It's like logically necessary that he doesn't know, which may be true, but I think there's a phenomenology there that's based on our inclinations to believe these things. Like we take it that in effect, that we must apply the concept, right? He's justified, or we must withhold the concept that he knows. And so it's actually a bit of a deontic phenomenology of deontology of our concepts and applying them. So that's the basic idea.
Right. And you don't think that, something without intuitions won't, could be enough. Like, I don't know, maybe if you just have the conceptual capacity might just be involved, but, being able to recognize when it implies and when it doesn't. And that's not something that maybe requires further intuitive faculty or something like that. I mean, why do you think, or maybe it's something based on associations that you've developed? Why do you think those non-intuition approaches, that's just not going to get you there?
Yeah, well, part of it is kind of what you said. You said you recognize that it applies, right? I mean, I think that's a way in which we talk about these things, right? Like, so I do think that. I mean, clearly we could infer, right? We could work at, what's going on here? Is this really a betrayal? Well, like we could reason through this explicitly. Now, of course, I argue later that the inference itself involves intuition. So it's not really going to get you out of the mess. But putting that aside, right? Many of these cases are much more direct than that. And, whatever's going on sort of subpersonally, right, the cognitive stuff for which we're responsible, and since we seem justified in making these and accepting these beliefs, right, like that in the Gettier case, so and so is not justified or is justified. Where does our justification for those beliefs come from, right? If it's just kind of out of the blue, then we don't have an account of that justification. I mean, Boghossian makes this point in his exchanges with Williamson, and I think it's just right that really you've got to account for all of the justifications, and so part of the strategy here is, well, what's doing the justification in these cases? If I can't find anything else, can I plausibly think of it as intuition doing the work?
Right. Yeah. Fair enough. I guess when I said, well, is recognizing that it's the case a sort of intuition-based thing, or is it not? I mean, if it's not, then maybe someone could make the case, but plausibly it is. What is it to recognize that it's the case? It's not necessarily to judge that it's the case, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it is. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, the thing is it's kind of like what you were saying earlier, that sometimes we use these terms loosely in a lot of contexts. Now, recognize the way you used it there was, it's kind of a bit factive or something like that, right? So in that sense, it doesn't really seem to be a seeming, but I do think that a lot of times, it'll seem to us that this is justified, and we may withhold judgment on that for other reasons, right? So it's not really an acceptance. It's not really a belief, right? Again, somebody could say it's an inclination to believe. I tend to think that those inclination to believe views are really strange, because, why you have these inclinations is not itself accounted for. So and why giving in to those inclinations would be reasonable is not accounted for. So there's a lot that's missing in that kind of story about intuitions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It can construct some strange examples where, like, I get knocked on the head, and somehow that inclines me to believe something. But is that an intuition? Like, yeah, I don't think so. Well, at least standardly wouldn't think so anyway. But yeah, one thing I did want to remark about this intuitions is playing a role in concepts here. Well, it's that intuitions are playing an important role in the practice of concept application. But you might also think that intuitions could or sometimes do play a role in like determining, or at least partly determining, the application conditions or like correctness conditions of concepts, so to speak. And I've often thought that some of our concepts might work in that way. You know, maybe even with knowledge, like part of what determines what counts as knowledge just is intuitions about particular cases and so on. And maybe that works also in some more everyday notions like chair and so on. Maybe not, but I don't know. What do you think about the potential role of intuitions to, well, I guess content determining roles or something like that, that I'm getting at here, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so it's been a while since I've thought about sort of concept mastery and that stuff. I mean, Beeler has a paper on concept possession, right, in which he effectively argues that what it is to have, as sort of determinate concept possession, is to have the right kind of intuitions in the right kind of situations, cognitive situations. But I don't know that I really believe that. I tend to think concept possession itself is pretty cheap. It's just, we pick it up very easily in the environment, and we have more or less a better or worse grasp of that concept, kind of in a birdie way. And, as our grasp improves, our intuitions will improve, right? But I don't think it's the intuitions that determine the grasp. I think it runs the other way. I mean, intuitively in the, not my sense, right? Intuitively, that's the order of explanation to me.
Right. Fair enough. I mean, that could be explored further. But speaking of what you mentioned there about how they can be very easy to pick up and grasp, one other thing you talk about there is like animal concepts and how you think that, well, you don't want to have a too robust notion of concept or concept application that would rule out animals having concepts, and maybe this view of intuitions can help preserve the intuitively correct assessment that animals do have concepts quite regularly. So I don't know, maybe you could add on to that, or is that how you put it there?
Yeah, that was in response to a very good comment by one of the referees, suggesting, well, look, do you think rabbits have intuitions about concepts, right? And up front that seems a bit odd. So I think that you probably want a finer grained sort of taxonomy here. So I definitely believe that animals have concepts and in some sense apply them. So in that little discussion, I say, look, you might think of this as a difference between, as it were, like mere predication and concept application, right? Where that distinction really turns on whether the resulting belief states are justified or not, or outside of normative evaluation. So I don't think, animals typically would be normatively evaluated when they make use of concepts, even if we have a sort of nominal notion of them having beliefs with content. But a lot of times when we make these judgments, right, similar judgments, we are epistemically accountable for those beliefs, and consequently, there's some difference in what's going on there. And my view would be that's where intuitions are applying, as opposed to just merely uptake of some representational content.
Yeah, but then it seems like you don't want to let the, so you do want to allow that or recognize that animals can have concepts, but maybe, or non-human animals anyway, but maybe they don't, they're not subject to the same sort of normative rules and assessment that we are. Maybe to some degree they are, but I don't know. How do you want to think about that? Do you think there are or can be norms in, say, rabbits in their application and understanding of concepts, or not?
I think empirically, right, the answer is, I think, not, generally speaking. Maybe in some very weak sense, it's like, evolutionary correctness, right, kinds of principles. But I tend to think not. I think what I say in the element is, look, if they really are like acting in the sense of, if they really are applying the concepts, that is, judging on the basis of this stuff, then yes, right? I mean, that's an empirical question for the cognitive ethologists to settle. I have a longstanding interest in cognitive ethology, so I'm super friendly to the idea that animals have pretty sophisticated mental lives, but I don't think they're that sophisticated. But if that's what they reveal, then that's correct. That's fine. I'm okay with that. But I don't think I'm forced to say that of them or to deny that of them. I think the view I articulate can happily say, let the scientists settle that debate for us.
Right. It's just a sort of further empirical question that's not, you don't need to take a stand on, I suppose. Yeah, it makes sense. And then, as you mentioned earlier already a little bit, one of the other considerations you explore is having to do with inferences and inferential practices. So you think that intuitions are important to inferential practices, but without themselves becoming or needing to become sort of premises in arguments, because it's like re-whisperers and so on. So maybe could you explain how you think it is that intuitions are important in inference?
Yeah. So of course, the sort of big recent sort of discussion in inference has been over, Boghossian's taking condition, and whether that should be cashed out as an intuition or something else, right? I actually tend to think it should be, but I didn't want to get into that part of the debate. Like that would be more than I wanted to wade into. But once I argued for the idea that intuitions are needed for concept application, right, then it makes sense that as an internalist, right, you're going to want to say that an inference, right, or something that's inference-like, right, really only counts as an inference, as an action that I'm responsible for, if, for instance, I consider or think of, say, the premises as reasons, or as premises themselves, or as justification, or as support. So I need to apply those concepts to those things, and that is going to, so in order to get responsibility for the cognitive transition from the premises to the conclusion, I have to think of the premises as reasons, right? Whether you have the full taking condition there or not, it's how we categorize them that matters. And so if we don't do that, then it's not really an inference that we're making, right? So the idea is that, again, because the crucial move is, once you think that intuition is involved in a lot of our concept application, then it's going to show up everywhere because we apply concepts all over the place.
Yeah, interesting. So, some of this reminds me of a few years ago, I talked with Susanna Siegel, and one of the things that we talked about, she had this paper called Inference Without Reckoning, and I think it's sort of connected because she had this view. I forget exactly, but it was something about how you can have sort of inference or inferential patterns without this sort of additional reckoning state, or the sort of recognition that in some way the premises support the conclusion. What do you think about that? I mean, maybe you still think the intuition's involved regardless whether there's sort of this reckoning state, but Do you have any sort of immediate thoughts about that sort of view?
Yeah. Part of what I was trying to do was sidestep some of that debate because there has been a bit of discussion um, about cases of about the notion of inference, and so that's connected to this, right? Can you infer without reckoning? Or I think Smithies has some work on this, and McHugh. So a number of people have argued against, right, even the need for a taking condition, and I sort of discussed some of that in the element. I think that some of the cases, for instance, that Smithies gives on this, I don't think are convincing. Like you go to bed and then you wake up and you just have this. I don't think that's an inference until you recognize um, the basis for that belief that you've woken up with. Um, but but in general, I've tried to avoid that idea that somehow you have to have something that bridges the premise conclusion divide. I think it's natural to accept that. Once, if you accept my argument, which is just that, yeah, but you still have to take these things, right? These propositions or whatever that I believe to be reasons, right? To be evidence or something like that. So you have to categorize them as having the right kind of status to do this thing that you do with them, to infer, and that's enough to make intuition be involved in inference.
Right. I did want to mention someone else that I've talked with, although we talked about a different book that he'd written, which is Herman Kaplan. We talked about conceptual engineering, but he also has his book called, the title was Philosophy Without Intuitions or something like that. And I think his discussion, the target of the discussion was a little bit tangential to yours, because he was saying that in there he argues something to the effect of about how he thinks that, well, philosophy doesn't really need intuitions as a sort of key piece of evidence in philosophical theorizing or something like that. I forget exactly how it goes. But and it's sort of tangential maybe to what a lot of what you say here. But I suppose just generally, what do you think about that sort of response to intuitions broadly? And like, do you think that intuitions are important in philosophy and philosophical theorizing and so on?
Yeah. So So there's two places that kind of motivated me to make the argument I give in the element. One is work by people like Capel and Williamson himself, right? When Williamson characterizes thought experiments, right, as counterfactual, just standard counterfactual reasoning kind of things, I think they do a disservice to the actual practice of what's going on. I don't think they're you may not like this, but I don't think they're being fine-grained enough about what's kind of happening in there. And the other group is, of course, that sort of negative X-Phi view that aims at kind of debunking the reliability of intuitions. In both cases, my view is that they're not really being sensitive to all of the things that have to be taken into account in order to give an adequate explanation of our justification or knowledge of the resulting states. And in the case of X-Phi, I think that, again, if my view is right, then in a certain way, that whole project of negative X-Phi, not positive X-Phi, is kind of misguided, right? In the same way that trying to decide the reliability of intuition would be. Now you could, of perception would be, right? Because you got to presuppose that perception is giving you evidence in order to run the experiments, right? So I would say the same thing about intuition and their experiments. That's not to say there's not a more, narrow focus in these contexts or in those contexts. And I think that actually can apply a bit to Capel and like how much were you really using intuition or not in substantively, like in the Gettier case. I think we are, but maybe in other cases we're not using it so much.
Yeah, interesting. Like, what do you think about using intuitions? Like, people who are intuitionists about ethics and so on. They think that the primary source of ethical knowledge is via intuitions or something like that. Do you think that is a plausible application of intuitions, or what do you think? Maybe this is tangential, but
Well, no, I mean, it's something I've been thinking a bit about, although I've been thinking more along the lines of aesthetic properties recently. But I think it's certainly, it's a tempting place to go. What I think, and I'll talk a little bit about aesthetics. I don't have a worked out picture here, but I tend to think that, like, when we perceive, say, a beautiful scene, that I don't think we as it were immediately, like, perceive the beauty, like, directly in the perceptual state. I think that's like, we see the we get the content of the state, and then we have an additional, like, overlaying intuition about whether it's beautiful or not. So I do think that again, because concept application is going to require intuitions, right? When you get to moral or political or aesthetic views, it's just going to be the same story, right? But where it fits into the picture is different, right? So, like, in the moral perception literature, there's this idea that we actually, as it were, in some way, see the wrongness of an action. I'm not sure I want to say that. I'm not sure I don't want to say that. I think you can go different ways, and part of what will determine that is what we actually think, what I call the presentational content is, right? So in perception, when I talk about perception in the element, right, I try to sort of isolate what is presented to us, which is something I think we have access to, right? I'm presented with the wall or the tree or the computer, right? Not colors and patterns, right? I have to kind of recover those things. So, but am I presented? So I think that we're presented with kind of robust four-dimensional states, and it's that presentational content that matters. Do I think I'm presented with the wrongness of the action, or am I just presented with the action and then I come to recognize it additionally as wrong? That's where I think the discussion is.
Yeah, that's good. Actually, I think I recall talking to somebody. It might have been Terence Horgan, I forget, who had this sort of view that the wrongness of some occurrence is sort of part of the phenomenology itself, and not a sort of further judgment or assessment or something like that. And I found that a bit strange, to be honest. But I don't know. Maybe there's something to it. I'm not sure. But speaking of perception and phenomenology here, I mean, that's something else you discuss where intuitions are relevant, and like you talk about how, like, well, what sort of perceptual experience you have, say you perceive a tree or whatever else, to some degree that requires certain conceptual capacities, and well, then you got the intuitions coming back in here, because having those conceptual, something like that, having those conceptual capacities requires having certain sort of intuitions or capacities for intuitions or something like that. I don't know. Could you explain the application here to perception a bit more?
Yeah, I'll try. So this was like the last little section of the book is a little bit more speculative. Well, maybe a lot more speculative, but the idea was, I have a sense when you look at much of the presentational content. So I make use of this passage by Strawson, P.F. Strawson, right, in which he's saying, look, if you ask somebody to describe the scene, they give you this robust description. And if you said, no, I mean, describe it to me in a way that is ontologically neutral or something, right? They'd say, well, it's as if, and then they'd give you the same description back, right? And if you did anything else, right, that you would kind of not be true to the phenomenology or the content of your perceptual state. And that seems, I think, very smart and very right. So that makes me think, right, I give a couple arguments that makes me think that the content that's presented to us, right, actually does involve higher level concepts. It's not just reds and patches or whatever lower level content is there, but our perceptual states actually have higher level content that can't be adequately accounted for just simply in the visual system or fed in through the visual system, but has to come somewhere else. And so here the natural place would be to account for that by applying a concept with an intuition, so that our full perceptual experience is actually kind of a hybrid state that involves sort of pure perceptual input and intuitive input, and that's how we experience the world, right? So again, that's it's surely the most speculative part of what I was arguing in the book, but I think it's a plausible. It's kind of a neo-Kantian kind of view, without this sort of noumenal, or not without the mind's doing it part, right? Because intuitions are actually just giving you presentational states themselves. So it's I think an appealing picture, if at least from a certain philosophical stance.
Yeah, good. This view about like what how you get these different perceptual experiences, and in part in virtue of the sort of conceptual or cognitive capacities that you have. A few people have said that sort of thing. I mean, I remember reading stuff from John Searle who defended that sort of view. Like, look, I mean, maybe on some level, someone might have an experience which is like, you might describe it in terms of sort of colors they're seeing, but insofar as they have more conceptual capacities in terms of how we individuate their experiences, they might have experience of a car or something like that. Now, in both cases, maybe there's a car in front of them, and so in some sense they're seeing a car, extensionally speaking. But in terms of the sort of experience they're having, what sort of capacities they have is relevant to fixing that. That seems plausible. But then if you say that, then you could step in and say that, well, having those capacities requires having the sort of intuitions or capacities for intuitions in the background. And so maybe that's where you're going there.
That is, yeah,
plausible, I think.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think it's nice because it dovetails nicely with the picture. I get this in the sort of discussion of the Copperhead case, right, where it doesn't have to affect in any robust way the phenomenology if you have my view of intuitions, right? Because the intuitions aren't providing some additional, more robust phenomenology to it. So the phenomenology between sort of the novice and the herpetologist who recognizes the snake as a copperhead, right? Their phenomenology can be, for all intents and purposes, at least narrowly the same, and yet they can have different presentational contents.
Yeah, actually, though, on that, I was wondering, do you think that it could be that the conceptual capacities and intuitions do make a difference to, at least in some cases, the phenomenology? Or do you think that's just always separate?
No, I think it can. I mean, again, this kind of goes back to the stuff on like trying to really differentiate what's going on with us and our phenomenology and the states we have versus the sort of broader philosophical discussion about what's really necessary in order to account for these things. So, because we in fact have a robust phenomenology, we're certainly going to, I think, certainly going to have knock-on phenomenological, like cognitive phenomenology that is going to occur for us. We might have even, right, phenomenology differences in the states themselves. But all that, I think, is largely contingent. It's not something I think that philosophers need to settle or even really theorize about.
Right. All right. Fair enough. And then, yeah, we've been going for a while. I do normally end with a kind of more general meta philosophical question, if that's all right. What would you say what do you think is the sort of value of philosophy? I mean, it's a broad question, but maybe you can speak for yourself or more generally, like why is philosophy worth doing, do you think?
So give me the hard question at the end, right? Yeah. So So actually, let me just start by saying this. I've recently been telling students that philosophy is the major of the future, right? So we've entered this era of AI, and the world it's really unclear what is going to happen in terms of workforce and demand, and how people are going to how science and academia and business is going to look in 10 years. So the students that are in college right now are really, facing a degree of uncertainty that is quite massive. And one of the things about philosophy that I think is super valuable is simply that it has these transportable skills. Right? Give us any problem, and we can, state fairly clearly, what the problem is, come up with, creative solutions to it. And so there's just this really practical feature of that skill set. So that's one thing I think is important. I think all of us philosophers should actually be pressing that point a bit, especially to the powers that be at the university. But a more general point, I'm actually working on a short introductory book right now for my introduction to philosophy classes. It's called The Pursuit of Meaning, right? And for me, the value of philosophy is that it allows me to really think about the significance of things I'm doing, right, in a careful way. So I can appreciate what's being achieved. I can appreciate, when I disagree with people philosophically, what they're doing, what I'm doing, what the debate overall is doing, what contributions I'm making, what contributions other people are making, the value of beauty, all of that stuff, right, I can assimilate and focus and bring to bear on my life, I think, in a systematic way without missing a lot. And I think there's a lot of value to that. Because when I talk to people who, aren't philosophers, I think a lot of times they have trouble like grasping, what is it that's important that I've done or I'm doing, right? And as I'm getting older and I have friends that are older, I think that they grapple with that a lot. And so I have these conversations where people are just where I'm like, this is what you did, right? It was useful and important, and this is why, and here's how to think about it. So that's my answer. Practical.
No, I like that, because it's good, because some people often think that, look, philosophy, that's just all kind of niche and esoteric and not practically relevant, even the skills that you develop. But no, I think what you said is right, and oftentimes those skills are highly practical and transferable and so on. So yeah, that's one value of philosophy. I definitely agree with that. But yeah, good. I will draw the questions to a close there, but thanks so much for coming on, Professor Moffett, and taking my questions and writing this element. It's been really interesting having the discussion.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.